worse, it can mean the absence of positive emotion. Because if you really collapse into chaos, not only are you overwhelmed by negative emotion, but the positive emotion system shut off, and that's what happens to someone who's extraordinarily depressed and also hyper anxious at the same time. Not only are they suffering from an excess of negative emotion, but they've got no incentive movement forward whatsoever. Okay, so that's not an optimal solution because it takes you out. The other possible, and so I would call that a nihilistic solution or a chaotic solution. It's not a solution, it's a dissolution. And you could think about it as a precursor to a potential solution, but it's very easy to get stuck there. And that's why Jonah could have stayed in the belly of the whale along with all the other people that were eaten by the whale and never got back out. And you see people like that all the time. Their error has come along, blown out their frames of reference, they've collapsed into the underworld, into the chaotic underworld, and they don't know how to get out. They have post-traumatic stress disorder, or they're depressed, or they're hyper anxious, or they're resentful and aggressive and destructive. Like, there's any number of states of being that can overwhelm you when the bottom has fallen out of your life. So it isn't something that people are going to, it's not an optimal solution, let's put it that way. Well, the other, that's a nihilistic solution, a collapse. The other solution is, we're talking and I don't get what I want from you, and so I say, you better not do that again. I don't want to see that from you again. And so that's a tyrannical attitude, right? What I'm going to do is I'm going to take my universe of order and its predictions, and I'm going to say, you go along with this or I'm going to punish you. And now there is an element in society, like society is made up of threats like that to some degree. It's an ineradicable part of society. That would be the tyrannical aspect of the great king, let's say. You know, we've organized a set of punishments and threats that keep each of us in alignment. However, generally speaking, in a society that's functional, we've decided to adopt agreement with that set of principles more or less voluntarily. You know, we say, well, you have rights and responsibilities, and I have rights and responsibilities, and I'm willing to pay a price for yours, including the acceptance of punishment if I transgress, but you're going to do the same for me. So there are intelligent ways that punishment and threat can be used and bounded. So, but that can easily degenerate into tyranny. And one of the methods that I can choose to use, if I don't want to encounter error, is just to enforce my will on everyone else. And I think when that happens personally, and in the family, and in the community, and in the state, all at the same time, then you get the emergence of a tyranny. And so I would consider those two counterproductive reactions to the emergence of the unrealized world. It's like, you say something I don't like, I collapse completely. Children don't like other children who do that, by the way, right? It's something that's very interesting to observe. So let's say kids have organized themselves to play a little game of baseball with a plastic bat and a ball, and one child pitches and the other child hits the ball, and the child catches it and puts the batter out, and the batter bursts into tears. Well, what happens is the other kids, the first time that happens they'll be sympathetic. The third time that happens they won't invite that kid out to play baseball anymore. So the answer to we're not getting along is not you get to burst into tears and manifest extraordinary emotional distress, because if you do that, no one's going to want to play with you. And that's a lesson that many people could stand learning again. One of the things I think that's really destabilizing our society right now maybe is that I'm not sure that kids have been encouraged or allowed to play enough in the last 25, 30 years. And I think a lot of this identity stuff is actually fantasy play. It's delayed fantasy play, because it's sort of what you do when you're 7 years old. It's like, well, I'm going to be this identity. That's what you're doing when you pretend. You're going to go along with that because we're going to play this out. It's like, that's fine. You don't impose that though, right? Not if you're a kid that has a clue. You invite people to play. You don't insist on your identity and their compliance with it. It's not a playable game. And you don't burst into tears and run off when someone won't play your game, because then they won't play with you. And then you have to turn to force. And that's fine if that's what you want to do, but you better look out, because you better be ready to use it.
Does creating a universal morality come with the responsibility of making sure it's applied universally? I mean, what I mean by this is if we can say belief structure A is better than belief structure B from a pragmatic perspective, does it come with the responsibility of making sure that people who are trapped perhaps in a tyrannical belief structure in somewhere else, do we have a responsibility against them?
Good question. I mean, that's part of the question that I, in some sense, motivated the American incursion into Iraq, right? So what's our responsibility in relationship to tyranny? That's a good question.
Because one of the criticisms current feminists are getting is for not protesting about the situation of women in, say, Saudi Arabia.
Yeah. Well, I think that criticism is more emerging because it's apparently paradoxical. I mean, they've laid out a set of principles to which, in principle, they adhere, and one of those principles is to reduce the destructive power of the patriarchy. It's like, okay, there's some destructive patriarchy for you. Radio silence. It's like, now what am I supposed to do about that? Am I supposed to question your adherence to those principles, which is exactly what should be done? So I think it's a criticism of performative contradiction. You say you're for this, but when it comes to act it out, you don't, selectively in this situation. So there's something wrong. There's something about your game that you're not being straight about. That's the criticism. And maybe there's rejoinders to that, you know. But, well, okay, well, responsibility. Well, you know, then you'd have to look at it at different levels of analysis with regards to interactions. You definitely have a responsibility to your partner and your children. Okay, so your responsibility to your children, as far as I'm concerned, is it's twofold. One, don't let your children do anything that makes you dislike them. And there's a corollary to that, which is don't be an idiot. You know, so that's partly why you need a partner, because your partner has to tell you when your demands on your children are excessive, because you're kind of, you know, you're not 100% oriented properly. But still, you're their target adult. And so it's up to you to help them choose a path that makes you want them to be around. Right? And that's your critical responsibility. And hopefully, you're enough of an analog of the broader community so that if they can figure out how to get along with you, it radically increases the probability that they'll be able to get along with everyone. So for example, if you're playing with your children, 2 years old, you help them, you encourage them to play in a manner that's fun. And if you get that down, then, you know, when you introduce them to another child, they'll know how to play in a manner that's fun. And so great, you've solved the problem. The problem is to get your child to enter into the collaborative social world. And so yes, you have a primary responsibility for that. And then with regards to your partner, here's something to think about with regards to roles. So my wife and I have had this discussion many times, and one of the discussions is, well, how are we to treat each other in public? And it isn't, her name is Tammy, the discussion isn't how should Jordan treat Tammy in public, or how should Tammy treat Jordan? That's not the discussion. This isn't personal. It's how should a wife treat her husband, and how should a husband treat his wife? It's impersonal. And it's partly, you don't put your partner down in public. Why? Well, it's not because you're hurting that person's feelings. That's not why. It's that you're denigrating the relationship that you are in voluntarily. You know, and some of the most painful days I've ever spent, one in particular I spent with a group of men who had been in therapy for their marriage, and who bloody well needed it, I can tell you that. And they spent their whole day complaining about their wives. Like, it just made me sweat the whole day. I thought, I can't believe I'm here with you guys. I can't tell you why I was. It's just, you know, it was just happenstance more than anything. And I thought, how can you be so damn dumb? It's like, it's certainly possible that you married barbarian witches. Fine. But you don't have, you're so lacking in sense that you would discuss that in public, not noticing that you picked them. So basically all you're doing is holding up a sign and waving it constantly that says, I'm an idiot, right? And so, well, back to responsibility. You have a responsibility to those whom you love and are obligated to ensure that they manifest themselves in a manner that's most beneficial to them over the long run. Now, you have the same responsibility, I would say, to yourself. but you'll have blind spots. Other people have to help you with that. But so the rule is, you know, you help your wife figure out how not to make a fool of herself in public. And she extends to you the same courtesy. And it's partly maintenance of the sacred nature of the relationship. It has nothing to do with you or her, precisely. It's broader and wider than that. Okay, so then that's 2 levels of responsibility. Child, partner, next level of responsibility. You're asked at your workplace to undergo unconscious bias retraining. And you say yes. It's like, okay, you've just admitted that you're a bigot, right? Because you're acting it out. It's like, I'm a racist bigot, obviously I need to be retrained. And so you might say, well, I'm not going to make a fuss about it, right? Or I've been told to do it. Or maybe you agree with it, fine. And if you agree with it, no problem. You can make a case for it. I think it's a weak and appalling case, personally, but you can make a case for it. You could say, well, you know, I am interested in my biases and how to rectify them, and like, fair enough, you know, people are biased. But if you object to it and you don't say anything, then you're complicit. And then it's on you. And you know, like, A causes B and C, and B causes C and D, and so forth. The thing doesn't always, but it has this tendency to expand. And you'll come home angry and upset, and you'll go to the training program and you'll think this is ridiculous, because that is what you'll think in all likelihood, and you won't say anything. But it eats at you. Well, you've abrogated your responsibility. And then you might say, well, so then that's how the community becomes corrupt. That's how the community starts to be corrupt, is that people turn a blind eye to emergent pathology when they know it's pathological. That's exactly what the Egyptian story says. Osiris is overcome by Seth because he's willfully blind. Willfully blind, which means he knows, but refuses to, he knows, quote, his predator detection systems have gone off. Monster. Well, then you're supposed to look, okay, exactly what sort of monster is this? Well, it doesn't have wings, it doesn't have a tail, you know. You cut it down into you cut it from the monster that it could be into the monster that it is. That's the first step. And then you take the appropriate steps. And then you also notice the other monsters, because here's something to think about. You're going to pay a price for speaking up, but you're going to pay a price for not speaking up. So it's like monsters on the right, monsters on the left. Pick the ones you want to battle with. If you decide not to make your stand, you weaken yourself. If you do it 100 times, then even if the monster was only this big, now you're this big, it's going to eat you. You know, when it was this big, you probably could have kicked it across the room. It's too late for that. You've capitulated and capitulated. You know, and so what you've done, and this is a way to think about it from a Jungian perspective, this is what Jung was trying to get at when he was talking about alchemy. It's like the thing that pops up to object to you is this incredibly complex entity. It's the entire world encapsulated in the event. If you interact with it, you unpack it. You differentiate your sense of the world, and you gather new skills. So for example, let's say there's something going on at your workplace, and you need to object to it because it's driving you crazy, and you talk it over with your wife so that you've got your head screwed on straight. You say, oh, I've got to say something. And you go there and you say something, and you know, you're stumbling and awkward and all of that. But you watch the response, and maybe you get what you're aiming at, maybe you don't, but you've learned a bunch. You've learned, well, I'm not as coherent as I could be. I'm not as good at putting my arguments together. My boss is more of a son of a bitch than he thought he was. This is a worse problem than I knew about. It's like differentiated, differentiated. So now the landscape is higher resolution, and so are you. Well, so good. So maybe you're a little bit better prepared the next time you have to do that. And so the issue here, to some degree, is don't lose an opportunity to grapple with something that objects to you, especially when the objection is rather small. Because that's something you say, well, I can put up with it. It's like, fair enough, like you don't want to make everything into a war. I usually use a rule of 3. If we're interacting and you do something that I find disruptive, I'll note it. It's like, potential dragon, gone. And I leave it be. And then if you do it again, I think, oh yeah, that probably wasn't merely situational, but I'll leave it be because that's still not enough evidence.